Something that was picked up on the last inspection of my VW Golf was that the rear discs and pads were getting low. The pads were certainly getting very low and the discs were getting quite lipped, so decided it was worth changing both of them. It only cost £43 for the pads and a set of discs, so it's not a lot of money. The first thing to do is to take off the caps that cover the wheel bolts, get hold of the locking wheel nuts and slightly loosen all of the bolts on the wheel. What we then need to do is to chock the car by putting a block of wood underneath the front wheel, front here, which will then stop the car moving. So first job is we've loosened the wheel bolts, and just need to then jack the car at the jacking point just underneath the sill here, making sure you actually use the jacking point, not the sill itself, and we can then remove the wheel and get access to the brakes. Remember, whenever you're working on the car, as well as jacking it, make sure you have an axle stand. So the wheel's now off. You can see here the pad is very thin. There's also, I'm not sure if it's visible in the video, but there's a few areas where it looks like there's cracking starting to come on the disc, as well as the lipping. The date that seems to be showing here is 11 years ago, so 2010. So obviously these pads have been on the car quite some time, done a pretty good job in that time, but it's now time to replace them. So first job is to remove the bolts that hold the caliper carrier. Once the car's secured, one of the things you need to do is to release the handbrake when you're working on the rear brakes, because otherwise the pads will be clamped onto the brake disc, so you won't be able to remove the caliper. So the bolt to the rear of the carrier is a 13mm and the nut in the centre is a 15. So just going to undo those, and top and bottom, there's one here and then there's an equivalent one at the bottom here, and we'll be able to lift the carrier out. What you'll then need is a bungee cord or something like that to be able to hold it in place so that it doesn't put pressure on the brake lines. That's now not connected on that side, so do the same at the bottom and we'll be able to lift the caliper out. Once the bolts are removed, it's a simple case of just using some leverage and you'll be able to lift the caliper off the disc, and the caliper will come away from the carrier. Like that. So once the caliper's off, we have the pads in place, and we'll be able to remove them and then replace the disc. I'm just using a bungee cord here to secure the caliper to make sure it's not putting any pressure on the brake lines here, and just to hold it out the way for when we're working on the disc. Just need to prise the pads out, and we'll then have to clean up these sliders as well. See, the pad on the back side is pretty badly damaged, and yeah, some of the coating has broken off there. Here you can see the difference between the old and new. So there's a cross-headed screw that holds the disc in place. Always a good idea if you've been doing maintenance to make sure that things like that get copper greased. You can see here this one is undoing really easily. I've had this out before and made sure that was greased so that it's nice and straightforward to get out, but sometimes those can get seized in place. Once that's done, then it's a case you can wiggle the disc free of the caliper carrier, and that then is out. Once the old disc is out of the way, you can put the new one in, and it's a case of getting the angles right to be able to squeeze it between the carrier and then be able to put the disc in place. And you also need to make, you can see that's now lined up, so just go put the screw in here and then that will hold the disc in place. It's a good idea to put a little dab of copper grease on the screw to make it easier to remove in the future. And once that's done, you can just tighten that in, and that will secure the disc in place. You can see here that there's some grease that's come onto the pad from having handled it and put it onto the hub. What I'd always recommend is using some brake cleaner just to clean both sides of the disc to make sure it's all cleaned off and not going to cause any issues with affecting braking. Such a massive difference in the amount of friction material there. New pads come with new bolts to hold the caliper onto the carrier. What we will need to do to get the pads in is to retract the piston so that the space will actually fit the new pads. Obviously, as the piston comes out, because the pads are that much thinner, the piston compensates for that, so we need to retract it to make sure that it will fit the new pads in. Before trying to push the caliper piston back, just need to loosen the lid of the brake reservoir, otherwise it will be you'll be pushing against a closed system and it will make it very difficult, if not impossible, to push the piston back. Making sure that you have sufficient spare headroom in there for the fluid to be pushed back from the caliper. So once you fix the caliper rewind tool in place, it's just a case of gently turning the lever to be able to compress the piston back into the caliper, and we'll then be able to put the pads on. But the main thing is to do that slowly, trying not to rush it. You don't want to risk tearing the rubber of the caliper. Eventually you'll get to a point where the piston is flush, virtually flush, with the rubber and the caliper body, and that's the point at which you can stop. So I'm just going to clean the discs with some brake cleaner, and we can then put the pads in place. Once the disc is cleaned up, you can then put the pads in, and they just slide in place, making sure they sit on top of the sliders. In fact, just do one on this side, I'll show that. So you can see the sliders top and bottom, and making sure that those are smooth so you can actually move the pad, and do the same the other side. You might just need to push in the sliders at the top and bottom in order to fit the caliper back in. So just tightening up the 13mm bolt and making sure we have this one held so we can actually tighten it. Now we have the new discs and pads in place and the caliper secured, we can refit the wheel. The one thing I will just do, as this is a brand new disc, is put a little copper grease on the face here, which will help when the wheel is put back on. Otherwise the wheel can sometimes stick on, which can be then more of a pain to get it off. Once the wheel's on, all the bolts tightened up, we can remove the axle stand, drop the car back down and move on to the other side. So as soon as you've finished everything, make sure you retighten the cap on the brake fluid reservoir. Get into the car and apply the foot brake, and you can then apply the handbrake, making sure that it ratchets up. You may find initially that it has a lot of slack to take. That will be as the caliper pistons are clamping in and readjusting to the right size. And through the wheels you can see the new discs and pads in place. So we now go and take it for a test drive.